I'm going to tell you about visualizing Macbeth. It's a part of a fairly long journey. I started working with my mother, who started this whole thing about visualizing Shakespeare many years ago, and I recently picked it up again after about 40 or 50 years. And my first thought was that visualizing Macbeth would make it more simple and easier to understand. And I've turned that around completely. I now am firmly of the opinion that Shakespeare is exceedingly complicated, and it really is complicated. And what visualization does is visualization allows people who are far too literate and who have grown up far too literate like me to actually understand what talking to other people is all about. That's the problem, I think, that Shakespeare, as I said, is very complicated. It's exceedingly complicated, as I'll show you. And I think the solution to the problem is quite simply that you have to understand what the layers are. Once you understand what the layers are, you can then start to think about whether you want to map them out in whatever way you want to map them out. I map them out in a very particular way, but that's up to me. You can map them out any way you like, quite frankly. But you need to map out the ways the layers work and understand all the layers. How many of you are storytellers here? Anybody who's a storyteller? A few, okay, good. Because part of what Shakespeare does is Shakespeare tells stories. The amazing thing about Shakespeare is that most of his work wasn't even published in his lifetime. So the idea that Shakespeare ever made money out of books or literate books is complete nonsense. Me, I'm a visual person. I like visualizing things. I've visualized all sorts of things in the past. I've been involved in all sorts of visualization projects. Visualization for me kind of solves the problem. Those are some of the layers that Shakespeare uses. He probably uses about 8 layers, just for starters. And he writes in 8 layers. And unless you understand that he writes in 8 layers, you're going to be lost. You're going to find Shakespeare far too complicated, unnecessarily complicated, and you're probably going to hate him. I hated Shakespeare as a child, as a high school student, even though my mother taught Shakespeare. I thought it was really boring stuff. The reason is that I was under the impression that all of Shakespeare was very noble and good. So I looked at Shakespeare, and I looked at Shakespeare to find where the good text was about all these wonderful things and this wonderful poetry he was doing. Shakespeare doesn't do that. He does write wonderful poetry at times. There's some poetry that I find absolutely astounding. But he also writes stuff which would only be acceptable, I think, in a bad PR company. He really does. And he chops and changes all the time. There's this wonderful scene in Twelfth Night where Malvolio comes on the stage and he says, "If music is the food of love, play on." And everybody quotes that. Nobody quotes 3 lines down the page where he says, "I'm sick and tired of love. I can't stand this love business. And as for music, it's rubbish. Get it out of here. You're fired." And he fires it out of all the musicians. Nobody quotes that. But that's the kind of thing that Shakespeare does. He's quite capable of writing, "If music is the food of love, play on," which is a lovely piece of, lovely riff, as it were. But he just goes somewhere else in the next 3 lines. And Macbeth is no different. So what he does is, he does these kinds of things. One is the tapestries of the text. Tapestries of the text is just areas where the text in one scene of one play links to the text of another scene, and often of another play. Thank you very much. That's just text to text. The second one is the geometries and symmetries of the chart. I visualize things in charts. So I'll visualize the whole of Macbeth in one piece, and I'll show you what that one piece looks like. And that's got to do with what I call the implicit geometries of the chart. The implicit geometries doesn't mean that Shakespeare thought of geometry when he was writing his plays, but I have, and my mother did before me, looked at Macbeth, particularly Macbeth, and saw a whole lot of geometry and geometrical symmetry in what Shakespeare was doing. That's implicit, it's not explicit. That's the second thing. The third thing is the rhythms of speech. There's a lot of places where Shakespeare confuses, pretty much like these dancers did earlier. They confuse text and music, and they just put text and music together. And it's not 2 media, it's 1 medium. So he uses things like done double, and Macbeth will be a drum, Macbeth doth come. And he uses the word Macbeth and the word come and the word drum, and he uses them all in one piece, and he just mixes them together. And they are rhythms of speech. There's a woman in London who does some amazing work with autistic children, and she does things like, she says, "Hello, Roy. Hello, Zabili. Hello, Barbara." And she spends the first 15 minutes of a workshop just going hello. And hello comes from Shakespeare's rhythm. I never understood what this rhythm was all about. Somebody said it's called iambic pentameter, and I thought, well, that's 5 beats. It's not 5 beats. It's 5 upbeats followed by 5 beats. So in musical terms, it's probably something like 15/8 rather than 5/4. It's really complicated stuff. But he writes in 5/4 or 5/4 plus 5 halves. So 7.5/4, whatever it is. But he writes in rhythm of the words is a major part of what Shakespeare does. And he just writes it naturally. Apparently, according to, I think, Ben Jonson, he never corrected his work. He never had to correct his work, which is absolutely extraordinary. He just wrote. So he wrote one whole play. Closed the play, wrote another play. I can't do that. I write 25 drafts. The other thing, the last thing he does is, there's a guy called Terry Eagleton who's a professor of literature in Lancaster at the moment. He was at Oxford and all sorts of other places. And Eagleton says that what you've got to realize about Shakespeare is that he obviously knew all the postmodernists and all the French linguists, Derrida, Bordeaux, etc., which is an outrageous statement. But if you look at Shakespeare, he does have implicit knowledge of all the postmodernist movement, which is kind of weird. It makes Shakespeare 400 years before his time. So all of this is what Shakespeare is writing. And he's writing in at least those 5. It's like an orchestration, if you look at Shakespeare. He's writing at least 5 or 8 parts for the orchestra. So the woodwinds, the strings, the brass, the whatever. And that's how he writes. And if you don't see Shakespeare as orchestration, you're missing the point. Because that's how Shakespeare writes. So he writes complicated stuff for the brass, complicated stuff for the woodwinds, complicated stuff for the percussion, etc., and he puts that all together in one play. And if you look at that and you think it's going to be something that you can relax in, you can just you can retire, as it were, and read Shakespeare, and you're in the wrong game. Shakespeare is complicated. So start with Shakespeare being complicated, and then you can move on from there. The first one is learning by doing. It's probably something I don't need to tell this audience about. If you learn by doing, you remember it. If you learn by doing, it's something that stays with you. For example, I taught at Colesberg Primary in Stellenbosch many years ago, and I came across this really weird piece of curriculum. I regard curriculum as normally weird, but this was kind of even weird for curriculum documents. And the curriculum document said that you're teaching standard 4 kids mathematics, and they didn't have mathematical skills, thank you very much. They were really struggling, but you have to teach them to count in different number bases. So I thought, you must be crazy to ask standard 4 kids who have no mathematical foundation to start counting in different number bases, or to ask a teacher like me to teach them this stuff. Then I looked out the window and I found that everybody in the playground was skipping. Skipping was what they were doing that week. Everybody was skipping, the whole playground was skipping. Skipping this way and that way and that way, whatever. So I thought, great. So I got all the kids into the classroom after break, and I said, right, clear the classroom, we're going to skip. They looked at me and they said, thought I was crazy. And I said, I'm going to teach you what number bases are, and you're going to have to skip and count in different number bases while you skip. And I just did skipping for 2 days. That's all I did. And at the end of 2 days, these standard 4s who had no basis in mathematics at all, they didn't know what a number base was, never heard of it, they could all count in number bases while skipping very fast, thank you very much. And I could change the number base halfway through. So I'd say skip in base 2, and they'd start 1, 10, 11, whatever. And they'd go through base 2. And then halfway through, I'd say change to base 9. And they immediately change to base 9, and they continue skipping fast. But they learned how to skip in 2 days. And they thought they were learning skipping in a funny kind of way, this crazy teacher. But what they were actually learning was number bases and counting in number bases. And I'm sure they remember, if there's anybody in the audience who knows, who was at Colesberg Primary in those days, you probably still know how to do skipping in number bases. The second thing is the characters. You really need to understand who the characters are before you can say, well, these guys should be black or yellow or green or pink or whatever it was. And one of the things that people, I think, don't realize, I didn't realize, is that people like Shakespeare's wife and lots of people in that area were what anybody else would call a sangoma or a dukum. It's kind of weird. It's kind of 400 years ago, and it's exactly what we would say now is a traditional healer of some sort. So Shakespeare's wife grew herbs. She ministered with herbs to the entire community around Stratford. She did medicinal herbs, culinary herbs, the bubonic plague went through England. At one stage, London was closed for 2 years. I can't imagine how London can be closed in those days, early 17th century, for 2 years, but it was, from the bubonic plague. So bubonic plague was like COVID plus plus plus. It was really vicious. And she ministered to those people. Eventually she ministered them because the bubonic plague was so bad. All she did was she had a little window, tiny little window, and she'd pass herbs to people on the other side, and they'd pass something back, so they'd pass her bread or something, a payment in kind mostly. But she ran effectively what we would now call a spice shop. Just one little window outside of her house, and she got all the herbs growing in her house, and she went to the window and she sold these things to people who came to her window. My attitude to resources is there isn't a resource shortage. There's a lot of human beings, and if you engage the human beings, resources are fine. There's plenty of them. So use the resources that you already have. Okay, let me get back to the chart. That's Macbeth. And that's not a Celtic cross, which it is, a Celtic cross about Macbeth. It's a Celtic cross of the whole of Macbeth in one slide. So that's got, you probably can see it, it's got things like the guys in gold are the royal family, the guys in red are the Macbeths because they're bloodthirsty kind of people. The guys in yellow are what Shakespeare uses for good, because good is associated in Shakespeare with sun, and sun is yellow, so you can color them yellow, it works. The red stuff here, all this red stuff in the middle, is 3 castles. And I'll show you where the castles are just now. But the bottom is one castle, middle is another castle, the top is another castle. And it's each 7 scenes. And what happens in this chart is a lot of things are symmetrical in the chart. So what happens on this side is either the same or opposite what happens on that side. What happens on this side of the chart is what opposite or the same as what happens on the other side. So there's a lot of symmetry and balance in this chart. And if you try and mathematically find a chart which is symmetrical 4 ways, so upwards, downwards, and diagonally, and it has 3 lots of 7 in it, you'll go crazy. So my mother went kind of crazy. She tried to find a way to symbolize this in one piece, one whole piece, and she couldn't do it. She just couldn't do it for love of money. Eventually she dreamt it. She dreamt of a Celtic cross. She woke up and she said, fantastic, I've dreamt of a Celtic cross. I'll try a Celtic cross. And the Celtic cross has 7 times 3, and it's symmetrical 4 ways. It's weird, but there it is. That's the basis of the chart, it's a Celtic cross. On top of that, you have 3 castles. Those bottom 7 scenes are Inverness, that's Macbeth's home. The middle is Forres, which is the royal palace, which Macbeth desperately wants to get into, his wife even more desperately. And the top is Dunsinane, that Macbeth is told by the witches will be his fortress where nothing will happen to him, nothing untoward will happen to him. Of course, he gets killed. But anyway, he thinks that the witches are telling him the truth. They're not telling him the truth, they're telling him fake news. Very modern kind of witches. That's the heath which surrounds the castles. So the castles are the red stuff in the middle. The heath surrounds them completely, and the heath also changes the minds, it gets into the minds of the people in the castles. So the castles are built as fortresses, they've got big walls, thick walls, etc., etc. It doesn't keep the witches out for a day. First day, Macbeth is in there, the witches are changing his mind. Because the witches, for some reason or another, are stronger than Macbeth. So that's a nice dramatic tension if you're interested in storylines. Those are the external settings: England, Fife, Hecate's Covenant, Burnham Wood. The princes, whose father gets killed, Duncan, their father gets killed. The princes go to England to get troops, as one does. In the other corner, at the bottom, Fife, Macduff tries to protect his family. It doesn't work. All his wife, all his kids, all the females in his castle get killed by Macbeth. Hecate's Covenant is at the top here. Macbeth goes to Hecate's Covenant to get more fake news, thinking that fake news is the best thing since sliced bread. He's totally mistaken, but he's just determined to get more fake news from the witches. They give him more fake news quite happily, because they're just pulling the wool over his eyes, basically. And what they do is they tell him about Burnham Wood, and they say Burnham Wood is going to be your savior at the end of the day. Burnham Wood isn't his savior at all. It's just worse. So that's really fake news. Because when you get killed for fake news, it's kind of serious stuff. The thing about the chart is it's very abstract, it's very academic. And I'm an academic, so I liked it. That is what my mother did with some of her students. She actually did a chart which is rich, it's emergent, it's changeable. It's completely different from the previous chart. So that chart is nice and academic and nice and clean. That chart is nice and messy. And because it's nice and messy, I really love it much more than the previous one. That's a piece out of the slides, which gives you Act 1, Scene 1, 2, 3, and 4. And what that is it's a culture war between Duncan, who's the king, and the witches, both of whom want to grab a piece of Macbeth. And Duncan, who is the king, seems to win, but he loses. By the end of the 4th scene, Duncan is finished. That's an example of how the tapestries of the plays work. The witches say, in the top right-hand corner, say, fair is foul and foul is fair, hover through the fog and filthy air, or whatever. When Macbeth appears for the first time in the bottom, in 1.3b, Macbeth says the same thing. He says, so foul and fair a day I have not seen. And he doesn't know what he's saying, but what he's saying is exactly the same as what the witches said. So Shakespeare is sitting there in his tiny little room somewhere in London writing this stuff, I think with a broad grin on his face, saying, I'm going to put the witches' words into Macbeth's mouth and see what happens. And he does it. That's more bad news from Lady Macbeth in 1.5 and 1.7, which is the two scenes in the middle at the bottom. Lady Macbeth is convincing Macbeth to murder the king, his king, who's also family. So it's family murder and regicide and everything all in one. But in the middle, in 1.6, Lady Macbeth greets Duncan and welcomes him to his death. I mean, welcoming somebody as a guest in your own house because you're going to kill them and you'd love to kill them is kind of weird. But that's who Lady Macbeth is. She really is kind of weird. And that is a mandala of all of the Shakespeare's plays. If you're going to get into this orchestration of at least, in my book, probably 9 different layers, what you also have to do is you have to get into what's common about King Lear and Macbeth and Timon of Athens and God knows what, all sorts of other people. Because all of that stuff is what Shakespeare does. And if you don't like complexity, leave Shakespeare. You're not going to be happy with it ever. If you like complexity, and you like visualization, you like playing around with things, and you like embodied learning, then that's fine. Go for this stuff and start drawing. Thank you very much.